Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Opinionated SEO Opinions, where we're going to discuss all things information gain and SEO. So we are joined by Bernard Huang from Clearscope for this episode, and the gang is back again. So I have both Tory Gray and Sam Torres as our hosts. Welcome, ladies, and welcome, Bernard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Without further ado, I am just going to ask our guests to introduce himself. So would you like to give us all details about you, Bernard?
Oh, all
life
the
story, let's
details. My life story, yes. I'm Bernard.
Start at the beginning.
Yes, I was born 19... No, in all seriousness, I'm Bernard. I'm the founder of Clearscope. We offer a content-first SEO platform, and I've been doing SEO for 11 years at this point. So long time in the making. Got started as a growth hacker, when that term was cool, in 2013 at a venture-backed startup that did commercial real estate listings. So that's really where I got my hands and feet wet with SEO, as commercial real estate and online searches just happen to make a lot of sense, in the same way that Zillow and Trulia do really well in SEO. From there, evolved into an agency where we served a lot of high growth companies like DoorDash, AllTrails, Strava on their SEO consulting issues, and then saw an opportunity to really help content creators optimize for search using entities back in 2016. And fast forward to now, just been doing entity optimization for the last 8 years, and that's worked pretty well. And it's a commonly accepted best practice, but I think a lot of people still kind of get SEO a little wrong here and there all across the board.
For sure. Also, I do just want to call out that we use Clearscope. We love the tool. So
yeah,
we're super excited.
Not just because Bernard's here. We have been longtime fans. Bernard knows this. We've done a few webinars and various things, and yeah, always been a fangirl. Always share it with our clients. We get them to get their own licenses because they love it that much.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your continued support. It does mean a lot to me.
It's a solid tool. So, if the quality goes downhill, well, then we'll talk. But, we're still really happy.
Threatening tones.
You got to do what's best for you.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I'm super excited because something that I know, Bernard, you've been talking about recently. So we're going to talk today about information gain, which I think, I don't think everybody in the industry knows yet. Yet being the key word there, because I think it is something that's definitely becoming more and more important. So, Lev, can you walk us through just what is information gain and why does it matter to Google and search engines as a whole?
Yeah, I've been off on a rant tangent with the SEO industry, I would say, for the last couple of years surrounding information gain. I think that, all due credit to Bill Slawski for the one really uncovering the patent back in the day. This is maybe 4 years ago, and seeing it as a very unique thing that Google is doing. So let's put it hopefully in the most simple terms, and then I think we can unpack, why it matters in more complex technical terms. So in its simplest form, information gain is the concept that Google wants to serve documents to end users that are additive to the topic that they're searching for. So in an example, say in SEO, we could argue that information gain is happening as SEO as a topic is evolving towards artificial intelligence and large language models like Gemini and ChatGPT. So in this example, we would say SEO, to add information to SEO as a topic, we should then be talking about concepts like artificial intelligence, Gemini, and ChatGPT. why it matters to Google is then fairly simple, right? Google understands that users are constantly seeking questions to their queries that they're asking to Google. And instead of keeping a static search engine results page that doesn't evolve as topics evolve, most of them, Google cares that topics, documents that they're serving the user adds to the topic in a meaningful and relevant manner. So Google wants to see information gain within documents that it's crawling to then verify that that document is indeed valuable to serve to the user for the queries that they're asking Google.
Yep. I often think of it as like Google's latest way to get ahead of the spammers and the people who create low quality content, right? Because if everyone can purchase access to the same tool and everyone is driving towards the same finish line of creating the same piece of content optimized in the same way, and it's the same listicle repeated across every single domain, and like, what is the value add? And it's not there. And so information gain is sort of the latest and greatest way that we're sort of privy to, that Google can really differentiate who knows what the heck they're talking about, because they're adding something new and valuable that has not been said on the internet yet, which is honestly a feat, right?
Yes. I think the concept is theoretically there. And, I think the interesting question is the actual application of, how it ends up playing out. And, I think on one side, you could say, like what Tory just talked about, where Google just wants any new information to be added to the document. But I think that breeds a whole set of potential problems.
Oh, yeah.
Right, where, just because something is unique or new to a given topic doesn't mean it's relevant.
Or accurate.
Or accurate, yes, for that matter. And then I think that, there's all kinds of other theories at play. My running theory currently, just again looking at the Google API docs that were leaked, is this idea of like site focus score, right? So, and like site radius. So I think Google understands, what a site is generally authoritative on in terms of, like the topics that it's covering. And I do think that you actually need a minimum amount of like focus on your like topical radius to qualify to play in the like information gain game.
Yeah.
And I think that that's reinforced by the fact that we just continue to see major publishers crush small publishers, in that those major publishers just have this like halo effect of strong site like focus score and site radius, regardless of whether they deserve it, like Forbes, for example. And they simply get the benefit of the doubt. And their information gain basically, weights double, triple, quadruple what a small publisher would weight. And it's this constant ecosystem battle where a small publisher might manifest a very intriguing and interesting piece that then gets crushed by major publishers who simply, kind of regurgitate what that piece contributed to the information gain, and then therefore that piece ends up being pushed down. And I think you saw that also happen with like the whole SparkToro iPull rank, domains just completely getting crushed by the publications, the news outlets.
That came from them.
But it came from them, right?
Yep.
And so I think that, right, this is like one concrete example of how this whole system is playing out, is that, you get rewarded for contributing new information, which is good for searchers and Google. But then as publishers move in who have more authority, they just overtake you, and the small publishers become disillusioned and dissatisfied, and it's a tough situation to be in.
It is. And then you add in the rise in, say, the Reddit and the UGC sites, which I'd argue is a lot about information gain. Like what information is not being covered that they need to put, these users' opinions about on the web, and certainly that goes haywire sometimes. And I'm thinking of the use glue to make the topping stick to the pizza example. Like, just because it's new doesn't mean it's accurate. Things go off the rails, but we should keep in mind Google's always evolving in this regard, and they're always improving their algorithm actively, and it's not perfect today. They're learning as we're learning, and we're all just trying to get better, and we aren't always making the perfect steps forward.
Yeah.
Okay. So, all right, I'm going to come back to a lot of that, but I do kind of want to start to understand, because Bernard, I think you're giving a lot of great things. I do at some point want to talk like, what do you recommend for the smaller publishers, things like that? What are ways that we can combat it? But first, to even just get a kind of an understanding of the information gain that you're providing or you're not, what are the tools or frameworks that you use to kind of measure or set benchmarks for that?
Oh my God. That is
an easy question. Just lobbed it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. There has not been concrete evidence on any specific approach that I can confidently, say. One step back, we would argue at Clearscope that by optimizing a piece of content for, like entities, what you're doing is you're at least providing a baseline of qualification for the Google knowledge graph, which is in a lot of ways correlated with information gain. So knowledge graph is, right, if information gain is how much new information is being added to a document for a given topic, knowledge graph is how much existing information and the relationship between subtopics already exists. So knowledge graph, then, we could say, again, back to this example of SEO, that Google understands that SEO, link building, quality content, and technical SEO all belong together, right? They're very closely associated with one another, because when documents talk about SEO, they'll generally hit these different associations, and therefore Google has a strong knowledge graph association of related topics. So essentially, right, when you're asking about what tools or methodologies can be used to measure benchmark information gain, we kind of have to start at this concept of, what is the topic about, and what is the kind of the bare minimum that you have to write about the topic and its known associations to qualify to rank in the Google sandbox, where obviously they'll test your content piece alongside millions of other content pieces with user engagement signal. So I think that the tools and methodologies that can be used to measure benchmark information gain are rapidly evolving, because Google is still, like, what Tory was saying earlier, trying to figure out. I think that, put in another way, let's actually, for a second, pretend like we are working on the Google search algorithm, right? Mm-hmm. So, they're oftentimes vilified because, Google this, cratered traffic there, misunderstood this, all of these different things. Mm-hmm. But if we were Google, right, we're all on the Google search algorithm team, and we are presented with this problem, right, for a given search, let's say, what is SEO as like the query, how do we create an algorithm that satisfies the user for this particular search? You can imagine that it's an extraordinarily complex discussion, right? We would say, okay, well, we can't just rank any site. A site has to have authority for this topic. Well, first of all, it has to have authority. And then secondly, it's better if it has authority on the topic. And then thirdly, we can't also just blindly trust that because it has authority on this topic, that anything it puts out is worthy of, right, testing against live users. So right through this whole thing, we would probably say, okay, well, there has to be some semblance of, backlink analysis. There has to be some semblance of existing content performance for related topics, which is now being, called topical authority. And then there has to be some notion that the document being presented is high quality enough to merit, serving to end users. So that's kind of, the way that obviously now we understand SEO is that Google checks this, Google checks that, and so on and so forth. I would say, in terms of then the methodologies, it's, the way that I'm approaching it, like Tory mentioned earlier, is that I think that Google's interest in Reddit, same with OpenAI's interest in Reddit, stems from the fact that communities are oftentimes the fastest ways to infer topical evolution, right? Communities are oftentimes the place where when something goes right or wrong, or just something happens in general, it gets shared to a community. So I think Google can take a look at discussions that are happening, right? Let's just take r/SEO, for example, and they can say, the Verge article here, or, this is happening
We're
there.
all content goblins.
Exactly. We're all content goblins. We love alligator parties, all that good stuff. And and they can say, okay, and if you look at the Google leaks docs, right, it's UGC times weight times 1,000. And okay, maybe that's why you see glue being, a viable solution to stick cheese to pizza. But I think that's what Google is saying, is okay, we have a big problem, because what I just listed earlier with the big publisher, small publisher tug of war, right, is that when a small publisher does indeed contribute, they pretty much get temporarily rewarded before the big people come in and they crush them. And then it's this virtuous cycle, except what's happening is that the small publishers are tapping out, right? They're like, well, that sucks. My AdSense revenues are, down 90%. My traffic is down 60%. Why bother anymore? And so, this algorithm that Google had was good and sustainable until the market got too saturated, right? There's too many publishers and too much authority that got accrued in the main publishers. And so I think Google looks at Reddit and Quora and these discussion boards, and they say, well, that's where we can get new information gain for this particular topic. Let's then use that weight, what the UGC boards are talking about. And so all of that was just a long-winded way to say, I think the most reliable way to think about information gain in the current algorithm is actually to go to whichever subreddits show up on your search, because they almost always show up, and then just do a Google Cloud NLP analysis, right? You can go to cloud.google.com/natural language processing and try the API. And so I think a very easy way to think about it is to go there, take whatever was the top 5 discussion board results that popped up in your SERP, and run it through Google's own entity analysis. And then you'll actually start to see kind of the core entities kind of be surfaced that I think Google is probably putting a lot more weight on. And then you can infer that that's the currently the correct information gain evolution for the topic.
I love it. That is super actionable. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I'd say that's something that we're working a lot in, as far as what you just mentioned of using really Reddit communities and other places too, like YouTube, TikTok, for understanding how conversations are changing. Because it's exactly like you talk about topics and how users are talking about them, what kind of information they want. It's evolving at an even faster rate than we've ever had before. And so it makes sense that these are tools, these are places where Google's going to try to understand their users better. Because at the end of the day, they still make most of their money on Google Ads, right? Despite everything that they own, still most of the money comes from that. So they want to keep people in search. And then on the flip side, I think there's also a lot of conversation about brands can be using that too. I think you have to be careful about it. But I also, I think maybe a starting place that I'd love, like if you guys disagree, push back on it. It feels like it's not really a tool or framework so much as it's just asking yourself questions and demanding honest answers of just like, have we demonstrated topical authority? Are we talking about the different facets of our topic? Are we adding interesting and unique perspectives, right? I think,
are we showcasing our subject matter expertise? Like what new questions are we getting from clients that we can bring to these assets that then we know other people are asking because of our experience and authority in that topic matter? But, to Bernard's point, that's not exactly measurable unless
right.
you're like A/B testing, but it's not scalably measurable to that point.
Yeah, I agree. And that's actually what makes it problematic, to be honest. It's, y'all work with all kinds of different clients, and it's very easy to go with a technical SEO checklist, for example, and say, hey, look, like your page is canonicaled incorrectly, or it's redirecting, or, Google can't index it because they can't find it. And, it's so black and white that it's easy to make those changes. But I think when it comes to this idea of, unique perspective, subject matter expertise, or EEAT, the Google sanctioned terminology, it's so subjective, right? It becomes this kind of like emotional, subjective, opinionated thing. And, like as an agency, I can only imagine you go to, a client and you say, hey, look, like, I'm sorry, but your piece of content kind of sucks because it's generic, it's bland, it's not adding to any, thing. It's just a pure definition. And you could imagine that is just hard for somebody to take, right? They're like, well, that's your opinion. Like, I think it's great content. And you get into this like, debate or discussion on the subjectiveness. But I think that's why we have this problem, is that it's so subjective, and people don't want to be kind of really told in a more gray like sense, like, hey, this piece of content's not, it doesn't exude confidence and subject matter expertise. And it's like, okay, but then what does? And then you look at like the Forbes article that's ranking number 2, and they say, well, Tory or Sam or Begum, like, well, that doesn't exude subject matter.
Right, like that's
expertise.
terrible. Why is that ranking?
So then you get in this like rabbit hole, and you can't whip something out, right? That's like, yes, this is, yes or no, true or false, right? It's kind of like this gray middle, and everyone gets stuck, and that's why we're in a weird spot.
There's also an interesting just dichotomy there in terms of like who the business is going to target for their customers. So I've seen plenty of people in, say, like real estate or mortgage lending. A lot of people need the baseline information over and over, and they need it at the right time in the right place. It's almost like advertising. And I feel like that's how oftentimes we treat new blog posts. It's a newsletter, and we're just repeating and respinning the same information again in yet another ad variation. But like, what is useful to a customer, a specific customer in a specific area at a specific time, and what they need then is not necessarily what Google is looking for in terms of like informing the web, the world as a whole, what is next level. and how do you do that effectively and speak to both audiences and succeed on Google? Like that can be a real challenge.
For sure.
I was
Huge
actually going to
challenge.
say, like, if we are daring enough to ask you for one more actionable insight when it comes to how we can use information gain and what we know from how Google is ranking content and what it wants us to include in the content, what we can recommend to our clients to have their content up to date in a way they can take advantage of information gain knowledge they know.
Yeah, it's complicated. It's very complicated. Well, I'm trying to think of another, clear, actionable. I think that something to be aware of is that I think not all queries benefit from information gain, right? Like, just simply put, it's, the more of the definitional, what is these types of things, they actually benefit from, in my opinion, like entity rich coverage and like semantic like convergence or consensus. So that's a caveat, right? It's that, if you're Googling Taylor Swift lyrics or, what is A/B testing, it's a very concise definition of, what that is. And yes, obviously A/B testing is going to evolve and change, but I don't think that that should belong in your what is A/B testing article, right? It should belong in a new, fresh perspective piece on why A/B testing is no longer relevant, because right, like tracking and privacy concerns and all of this stuff just make it really hard to get at like concrete evidence unless you're operating a large scale website like an Amazon or Google or something like that. So I think those are interesting tidbits. And then I think that the other thing that I'm realizing is that EEAT was never mentioned in the Google Leaks API documents, and my opinion on the matter is just that it wasn't mentioned because Google is aspirational in what they're recommending there. I think what they're saying is that EEAT, content that exudes expertise, experience, authority, and trustworthiness tends to be more engaging to the user who is consuming the content. And so I think, the more human way to think about information gain is really to think about it as a way to boost user engagement, where user engagement is defined by your content's ability to end the query, right, the search. And so Google's going to look at what percentage of people who click on your content at whatever position it tested it as finding what they needed, right? Which is not going back to Google and pogo sticking or whatever you want to call it, right? Clicking on another result, performing an additional search. So I think that, that's probably, again, it's more hand wavy and, not that concrete. But I do think that, that's why I think it's important to just answer the searcher intent as quickly as possible. I say it time and time again, and I think that it's because we've gotten so warped and so distorted on how SEO content gets created, right? It's like how to create a perfect SEO brief. And then it starts with, like, what is an SEO brief? And, it might even include a statistic about how, 32% of projects that, start without a brief end in failure. That gets, quoted by some site that literally doesn't very much so convey authority, because the statistic was supposed to be, more credible or more useful in, how SEO content, works. So anyways, I think that the other hopefully simple thing, it is kind of hand wavy, is that if you're going to write a piece of content on how to create the perfect SEO content brief, just start with here's how to create the perfect SEO content brief. Step one, identify the searcher intent. But yeah, a lot of people
SEO
seem to miss that.
Just look at what SEO did to recipe blogs, right? Like,
yeah,
it's a joke now at this point if we have to scroll through this blogger's life story about the memories of making butter with their grandma, and I don't know. But I think, Bernard, you bring up a great point. If we do that kind of across the board, we almost consistently write landing pages or blogs, or I think there's just been a practice of creating content that's almost like a research paper, like we did back in college and things like that. So I do like your point of just get into it. Google just wants to serve answers to people, and they want to do it as quickly as possible so that users continue to use Google. And it is kind of interesting to see just how difficult it is, right? Like your earlier comments about, let's imagine we're the search algorithm team. Like, that's a daunting job. I do not envy them that. Like, the people who are doing that, there is just so much. And then I think, and we've talked about it quite a bit, about how like Gen AI has just multiplied the amount of fluff. And so being able to really add that unique perspective is the only way for us. I agree that it's one of the things that we talk with our clients all the time. Like, that's the only way to win, is to add something unique. I do think it's interesting. This change is making that we don't have to write as much what is content. Like, I think previously, to establish that topical authority, there was a lot of like, no, you have to tackle the 101 content. And a lot of pushback would get from clients was like, if you don't know what this is, then you are not qualified to be a customer. I'm really enjoying that. It seems we're getting a break from that, because I've shared this probably hundreds of times at this point, but I had a customer who was in the construction business. They made concrete forms. And so we had we had a series about the history of concrete. And like, y'all, that is first as boring as you think it is. And then like, obviously, to like the person who's actually going to buy these products, knowing the history of concrete doesn't actually help them in their job at all. So, I will say that's one thing, like with this more move to EEAT, topical authority, information gain, it feels like we can get back to talking, or maybe this is it. It's forcing us to focus more on only speaking to the customers that actually matter. And instead of trying to cast these wide nets. So obviously, if you're a publisher and your whole monetization goal is number of eyeballs, then that's different. But like, we've definitely seen with some of our clients where, hey, our traffic has gone down, but your leads haven't. Yeah. So I'd say our program's actually performing pretty well. So anyways, that was kind of a soapboxy thing.
But I think it ties well to what Bernard has been talking about in terms of what he's coining the ranch style SEO, right? And like, if you're going to do an article about the history of concrete, at least it's a different article, instead of starting off every single article with concrete about like a paragraph that's like, well, where did concrete come from? Like, at least it can be a standalone piece instead of yet another paragraph so I have to scroll down to get to the content that I care about in the context of this specific article. I am happy that we seem to be evolving a little bit away from length means quality, which I think we have for a long time, but it's hard to break the trend around that. And it means all the data is often that length does matter right now, because that's who's created the content and who's ranking today. So correlation analysis in terms of ranking factors, they do those all the time, right? Like, yeah, because that's who won then. That doesn't necessarily mean what's happening now.
Yeah, it's true. I think Google Leaks doc also surfaced a very interesting point around that they called original document, but it had to be short. That was like I don't know if y'all had seen that one, but it's like they like cited how they actually do some sort of originality check specifically on like short content. And it's like, why is it short? And why is the originality like check on that? And I think that might be featured snippet like related, right? Is that, short content is a better fit for featured snippets, and also something to do with entities. So my like hypothesis, at least on the whole, like longer is more quality myth, is that I think before the advent of content optimization, this is like Clearscope and other tools, you just simply kind of played this game of like whack-a-mole, right? Where you said, okay, well, if I just kept writing about mortgage loans, I'll eventually get to, like this provider or this definition or, this like weird rule in, buying a second home. And what you did was inadvertently, right, whacked many of the entity moles that like, Google's knowledge graph was basically trying to check for. But now with, the advent of the like tools like Clearscope, what you're seeing is that you can actually arrive at more entity rich content faster, right? And so you don't have to spew 3,000 words. You can actually do it in 1,200. And I think that, that's a big shift that people are really kind of missing to a degree. And also, I think, what AI models are actually like sort of looking for, right? There's this like ongoing thesis where a passage needs to be semantically very rich. And that relates to the entities and the knowledge graph and the semantic relationship of how everything kind of pans out, right? Cindy Crum calls it Fraggles. Mike King refers to it in a lot of different ways as well with his retrieval augmented generation ideas, or RAG. And it's this idea that, right, it's machines know entities because that's how they were trained in terms of natural language like processing and embeddings. And essentially what you do when you create, more entity rich content is that you, the way that I think about it is like you tickle the algorithms like fancy, right? An algorithm looks at, say 600 words where it's so entity rich and so semantically, like correlated. And it looks at that passage, right? And it says, wow, that's so good. Because, right, like if we're talking about what are the different types of content marketing, and then it just goes to a bulleted list that says like white papers, webinars, podcasts, whatever. And it's like entity, entity, entity. And it looks at that and it says, that's so good. And then that actually qualifies you for the AI overview or the featured snippet. So why I kind of say that is that I think you have to understand like why information gain matters. And in some cases, it doesn't. It's about being as entity rich in a succinct and short amount of content as possible. And you actually kind of see that mostly happen with like how-tos, what is, and benefits, right? It's like, top benefits for, eating low carb, it should say blood sugar control and this and that and that. And the more like rich it is, the more machines are going to like it. And that's good for those query classes. And then, you need to then kind of subsequently have this like, why you should or shouldn't consider a low carb diet, and have that actually add information gain. So essentially, I think what you're doing is that you're actually optimizing for separate models that are looking for different outcomes because of the class of query that it belongs to. And so in doing this, you like both qualify for featured snippet, AI overview, and you qualify for, rank 1, rank 2, which is ideally the outcome, right? Is that you grab as much screen real estate as possible. And I think I'm seeing like a two model optimization that's starting to form, right? Like what happens in the above the fold and then what happens in the below. And I think, what you're seeing with Google really giving Reddit and Quora and discussion boards a ton of traffic is that they're saying, we care about unique perspectives in the SERP. But then what they're saying in their above the fold, which is the featured snippet in the AI overview, is that we care about semantically rich entity comprehension. And so I think that's like this two-tone model that I'm seeing like play out.
I love that. That feels very actionable. Yes.
So technical for the content guy coming in here. I love it.
Yeah.
Bernard's always going to bring it.
And I think I'd also want to add to that, like, so having that semantically rich kind of content, also always be considering what are the different formats that same piece can take. So kind of the Ross Simmons create once, distribute forever, like we are still seeing those types of things work because what we were talking about earlier of communities evolve and topics evolve. Sometimes the evolution is just the medium, right? It's not even the information. It's just how we want to receive it. So lots and lots of actionable things, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us, Bernard. It's been, I think, really insightful and actionable in terms of what the heck is this whole information gain and like how do you start exploring it. It's been really wonderful.
It has.
Oh, of course. It's an honor to be here to debate, discuss the forefront of search. I think it's a time of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but I also think it's a time for change, and winners are going to be the ones who are at the forefront, testing, evaluating, experimenting with different mediums, different content formats, different things that are so, say, keyword centric or text rich, right? They're going to say, let's try something perspective driven, zero search volume. Let's try, videos and multimedia and imagery to, reinforce certain things. And I think what they'll find is that, the answer is neither here nor there, but it depends, depending on, what the query is and, what the topic is and how quickly it's evolving. And generally, another like insight I've been tossing around in my head is that like Google SERPs exist to serve, I would say, like the 70% of society, like society's knowledge of the topic at 70%. And I think that what has happened is that you've seen a Google that has gotten very bland as a result, right? So the leading 30% of people, this is just a rough like assessment based off of what my own personal searches, but I think the 30% that's looking for deep, technically rich stuff are dissatisfied because the search algorithm is trained on all like the users that are using Google, and you can imagine that we're like operating under the 70% of like understanding that user engagement is reinforcing by Google. And so really, right, to think about it, information gain then is not about your knowledge of the topic. It is about being ahead of the 70% of what people believe in the topic. And I think that's one of the most confusing things about like how information gain works, right? It's like, if I'm too far, right? If I'm like, oh, search is going to converge with crypto because crypto is a, like blockchain is a irrefutable like way to like measure credibility and something. Well, that maybe is in like the top 1% of like divergent thinking, and that's too far, right? I need to actually just be at the 30%, in which case, I'd be talking about what I'm talking about here, right? Which is information gain, AI, entities, and that kind of stuff. So anyways, just another like, interesting
It's a good framework for understanding, what value to add. Don't give every deep thing you've ever thought that you know in your expertise. Give out the next step of what people don't know yet.
That's it. Yeah, exactly.
Love that.
Well, this has been fantastic. As we close, Bernard, anything you want to add, or where can people find you, follow you, connect, all that good stuff?
Yeah, I think that I just want to add, Grey Dot is an amazing agency, so definitely go with them for your SEO and content needs.
We did not pay him for this.
We appreciate you.
Yeah, I'm on socials, X, LinkedIn. It's just Bernard J. Huang, which is my middle initial between my first and last name. And then kind of follow along. I think again, there's a lot of confusion in the ecosystem. I have my own fair share of confusions, and what we're doing is we're testing a lot of hypotheses on these ideas of entity rich optimization, complete unique perspective driven content that's not at all grounded in any semblance of keyword research. And we continue to share our learnings on social and all of those different places.
Also, go to clearscope.io/newsletter to sign up. You should definitely sign up for their newsletter.
Yes.
We give all that away for free. So, well, thank you so much for joining us today, Bernard. This was fantastic. Tori and Begum, always lovely to talk with you ladies as well. If you have any SEO questions, lose my words, go ahead and send them to us at thegrey.company/ask SEO, and we will catch you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.